Hello and welcome to Medieval Nocturnes. Tonight, we're leaving behind the grand narratives of kings and castles to explore a far more common and far more uncomfortable reality of the Middle Ages. We're asking a simple question. When the vast majority of people were poor, dirt-farming peasants, where did they possibly stay when they had to travel? It's a story not of cozy inns, but of cold floors, suspicious livestock, and profound desperation. If you enjoy these quiet explorations into the past, please consider subscribing. Now, find a comfortable position, let the world outside fade away, and let's begin our journey into the muddy, weary world of the medieval traveler. The decision to leave your village as a poor peasant was never made lightly. It was less a choice and more a last resort. An admission that whatever you were facing at home was somehow worse than the guaranteed misery of the open road. Your world was your village, a tight circle of thatched roofs, familiar grievances, and the same 40 faces you'd seen every day of your life. But sometimes, staying was not an option. Perhaps a lord demanded a message be carried, a distant shrine called for a penitent pilgrim, or the promise of seasonal work, and the coin it brought was the only thing standing between your family and starvation. So, you decide to go? Packing for the journey is a simple, grim affair. You have no leather satchel or sturdy travel chest. You have a rough burlap sack, and its contents are as meager as your prospects. Inside, you place a hard, dark loaf of bread, perhaps an onion for flavor, and a small wedge of cheese, if you were exceptionally lucky. Your cloak, a piece, of course, scratchy wool that has served as your blanket, coat, and towel for years, is your primary defense against the elements. Your only other possession is a sturdy walking stick, useful for testing the depth of mud puddles, leaning on when your legs give out, and warding off overly aggressive dogs. You stand at the edge of the village, the familiar smell of wood smoke and manure behind you, and the unknown ahead. There are no maps for people like you. Maps were the domain of scholars and kings. Your directions are a string of landmarks passed down in conversation. Follow the river until you see the 3 crooked oaks, then turn toward the rising sun. Distances aren't measured in miles, but in days of walking, in the number of times you'll have to beg for water, and in the slow, grinding ache that will soon settle deep into your bones. Before you depart, a visit to the village priest is essential. In a small, dark church that smells of damp stone and old incense, you ask for a blessing. He mumbles a few Latin phrases, making the sign of the cross over your bowed head. His prayer is a practical one, asking for protection not just from demons and sin, but from the more immediate threats of bandits, wolves, bad weather, and the dreaded dysentery. He offers no food or coin, only a solemn, worried look that confirms what you already know. This is a terrible idea. The goodbyes are brief and unsentimental. Your mother, her face already etched with the lines of a hard life, presses a small, smooth stone into your hand for luck. Your father claps you on the shoulder, a silent gesture that says everything from be safe to don't come back empty-handed. Your younger siblings, too young to understand the gravity of your departure, merely watch with wide, curious eyes, while your elderly grandmother, who has never traveled more than a mile from this spot, simply nods, her gaze distant, as if she's already mourning you. And then you walk. You place one foot in front of the other, leaving the only world you've ever known. The road is not a road, but a muddy track, rutted by cartwheels and pockmarked with puddles of stagnant water. You trudge onward, sharing the path with lumbering ox carts, flocks of sheep, and the occasional nobleman on horseback who passes you in a spray of mud, not even acknowledging your existence. The sun begins to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The beauty is lost on you. All you can think about is the cold that's beginning to seep into your bones, and the gnawing question that will define your journey. Where in God's name are you going to sleep tonight? You've walked until your feet are just tender lumps of ache and blister, and the last light of day has been swallowed by the horizon. Every inn you've passed has a warm, inviting glow, but their doors are as closed to you as a king's treasury. The price of a room, or even a spot on the floor, is a handful of coins you simply do not possess. So, you turn your gaze to the next best thing. The medieval peasant's most reliable and sought-after accommodation, the humble barn. A silhouette against the starry sky, the barn is a promise of basic survival. It's a structure built for creatures with 4 legs and no ambitions. But for tonight, it represents the pinnacle of luxury. It has a roof, which is more than the open sky can offer, and walls that might keep out the worst of the wind. Its air is thick with the scent of hay, manure, and the warm, earthy breath of livestock, an aroma that, to a desperate traveler, smells remarkably like safety. But you cannot simply walk in. Ownership and property are jealously guarded concepts, even among farmers. You must approach the nearby farmhouse, a small, dark shape with a wisp of smoke curling from its chimney. With a heart full of apprehension, you knock on the rough wooden door. You rehearse your plea in your mind, hoping the farmer who answers is weary and charitable, not drunk and territorial. You pray they don't already have 3 other desperate travelers sleeping in their hayloft. To your immense relief, a gruff but not unkind farmer agrees, gesturing towards the barn with a tired grunt. You slide open the heavy wooden door, its creak echoing in the sudden stillness. Inside, the darkness is almost total, broken only by faint moonlight filtering through cracks in the walls. Large, silent shapes shift in the gloom. Cows chewing their cud, their slow, rhythmic grinding a soothing sound. You have been admitted to the company of beasts, your hosts for the evening. You find a relatively clean patch of straw, burrowing into it to create a small nest. This is not a bed, but it is softer than the cold, hard ground. The true luxury, however, is the warmth. A large, docile ox, radiating heat like a living furnace, lies nearby. You curl up a respectful distance away, close enough to feel its warmth on the cold air, but far enough to avoid being accidentally crushed if it decides to roll over. For the first time all day, the shivering in your bones begins to subside. Of course, sleeping in a barn comes with its own unique set of discomforts. The straw is alive with things that bite and crawl. The air is a rich tapestry of smells, from the sweet scent of dried grass to the sharp tang of ammonia. And the sounds. A pig snorts in its sleep. A horse shifts its weight with a heavy thud, and rats skitter in the rafters overhead. It is a symphony of rural life, a constant reminder that you are a guest in a space not meant for you. Yet, you wouldn't trade it for anything. Here, in the dark, surrounded by the gentle sounds and smells of animal life, you are safe, you are dry, you will not freeze. As exhaustion finally pulls you under, you fall asleep, not so much into peaceful dreams, but into a deep, dreamless state of oblivion. In the grand hierarchy of peasant lodging, the barn sits comfortably between a wet ditch and a miracle. and compared to sleeping completely exposed to the elements, it is practically a 5-star. So, the barn door was barred, the farmer's dog was far too persuasive, and the last village you passed looked at you with a collective, unwelcoming stare. This leaves you with the most basic and dreaded of all options. Tonight, dear traveler, your bed is the earth itself. Your roof is the vast, uncaring expanse of the night sky. You are sleeping outdoors, an experience that combines the thrill of camping with the constant, low-grade terror of being poor and vulnerable in the Middle Ages. Your first choice is a field. It seems promising at first glance, a flat, open space, carpeted in what appears to be soft grass. But upon closer inspection, the ground is a minefield of thistles, sharp rocks, and the unavoidable, squishy evidence of livestock. You search for a suitable patch, one that isn't actively waterlogged or directly in the path of a wandering cow. The ground is cold, and you can feel the dampness seeping through your thin cloak almost immediately. If you have any sense, you won't lie down in the middle of the open field. The wise peasant aims for the margins, the edge of the woods, the lee of a stone wall, or nestled in the thorny embrace of a hedgerow. These locations offer a slight break from the wind and, more importantly, a degree of concealment. The last thing you want is to be woken at dawn by the toe of a boot belonging to an angry farmer named Godric, who has strong opinions about strangers sleeping on his land. Then there is the forest, an option you consider only when all others have failed. A medieval forest at night is an excellent choice if you wish to spend your sleeping hours in a state of heightened paranoia. The woods are quiet, but it is a heavy, watchful quiet. Every snap of a twig becomes the footstep of a bandit. Every rustle in the undergrowth is a wolf, or a boar, or something far worse that the village priest warned you about. You don't so much sleep as you do lapse into a shallow, fearful coma with one eye open. The darkness in a forest is absolute, a thick, inky blackness that swallows all light and plays tricks on the mind. The wind whistling through the branches sounds like whispering voices, and the distant hoot of an owl feels like a personal mockery of your situation. You find a spot at the base of a large tree, pulling your knees to your chest and trying to make yourself as small and uninteresting as possible, hoping to be overlooked by both the natural and supernatural dangers that call the forest home. Still, there are fleeting moments of strange beauty. On a clear night, the stars are a brilliant, silent spectacle, more vivid than you could ever imagine from the smoky confines of your village hut. The air is clean and crisp, and the gentle breeze can feel like a blessing after a long day of dusty travel. These small comforts are free, a rare and precious commodity in a world where everything else has a price. They don't make you warm, but they make the cold feel slightly less lonely. Your only bedding is your worn woolen cloak, a garment that smells of wood smoke, rain, and regret. It offers little in the way of insulation. You wrap it tightly around yourself, curling into a tight ball to preserve every scrap of body heat. You mutter a prayer to whichever saint is responsible for lost causes and shivering travelers, not truly expecting an answer. Sleep, when it comes, is fitful and shallow, a temporary surrender to an exhaustion so deep it overrides even your fear. To wake with the sunrise, cold and stiff but otherwise unharmed, is the only victory you can hope for. You've endured the field and survived the forest, but the thought of another night spent listening for wolves is more than your weary spirit can handle. As twilight descends on a new village, your eyes fall upon the one structure that promises a different kind of sanctuary. It's not an inn or a barn, but the stone church, its steeple, a dark finger pointing towards a heaven that feels very far away. You're not heading for the pews, you're heading for the churchyard. Welcome to hallowed ground, the final resting place of the righteous, and for tonight, your humble bedroom. The appeal is surprisingly practical. Most churchyards were enclosed by a low stone wall, offering a barrier, however small, against the dangers of the open road. Bandits, it was believed, were less likely to ply their trade on consecrated soil. After all, even the most hardened thief might think twice before robbing someone within arm's reach of a saint's tomb. The dead, you reason, are far quieter and less judgmental company than the living. You find a secluded spot, perhaps in the shadow of the church itself, where the stone wall offers a solid backrest. The ground is uneven, dotted with the sunken mounds and weathered headstones of generations past. You might choose a flat grave marker as your mattress for the night, a cold, hard slab of stone that offers a grim sort of irony. You are alive, seeking a few hours of peace atop someone who has found it for eternity. The air is still, heavy with the scent of damp earth, moss, and a quiet, ancient reverence. Of course, this lodging is not without its risks. The local clergy did not officially run their graveyards as medieval campgrounds. You could be woken in the dead of night by a grumpy priest holding a lantern, or a nun with a broom and a sharp tongue ordering you off the sacred premises. And you might not be alone. On a feast day or near a market town, the churchyard could become a silent, crowded gathering of the dispossessed, each person claiming a small patch of ground in a shared, unspoken misery. There were, however, potential comforts. Some larger churches featured a covered porch or a structure called a lychgate, where coffins were traditionally rested before entering the church. These offered a solid roof over your head, a true luxury that kept you dry from rain or dew. There was also the slim but persistent hope of charity. A kindly priest, seeing your tragic state as he went for early morning prayers, might take pity and offer you a piece of bread or a bowl of thin, watery soup. Sleeping among the graves also offers a unique form of perspective. As you lie curled against a moss-covered tombstone, the cold seeping into your bones, it's impossible not to contemplate your own mortality. But it also serves as a stark reminder. As miserable as you are still breathing. The silent residents around you have finished their journeys. Yours, for better or worse, continues with the dawn. It's a strangely comforting thought in the deep, silent dark. So you settle in, a temporary guest among the permanent inhabitants. You close your eyes to the carved angels and faded epitaphs, listening to the wind sigh through the ancient yew trees. It's a cold, somber, and deeply unsettling place to sleep, but it feels safer than the woods. Here you are under the watchful eye of God, or at the very least, protected by the superstitions of men. And in the medieval world, sometimes that was the best you could hope for. You are too broke for the inn, too cold for the woods, and your nerves are too frayed to spend another night sleeping next to a corpse in the churchyard. Just as true desperation begins to set in, you see it on the horizon, the solid, imposing stone walls of a monastery. These were the sanctuaries of men who had sworn off worldly possessions, and for a weary traveler, they represented the last and best hope for a roof, a meal, and a night free from fear. Let's be clear, however. A monastery was not a medieval bed and breakfast. You couldn't simply knock and ask for their finest room. The process began with a long, humble wait at the massive, iron-studded gate. Eventually, a porter monk would appear, peering at you through a small grill with a suspicious eye. Your job was to look as pathetic and pious as possible, convincing him you were a genuine traveler in need, not a bandit looking for an easy score, or, worse, a heretic looking to start an argument. If you passed this silent inspection, the gate would creak open, and you would be admitted under the ancient rule of hospitality. Treat the stranger as you would treat Christ. Stepping inside felt like entering another world. The chaos and filth of the road vanished, replaced by the hushed quiet of stone cloisters, the scent of beeswax and incense, and an overwhelming sense of order. You were now a guest of God, expected to behave accordingly. You might be offered a meal, the first real food you've had in days. It would not be a feast. Monks ate simply, and you would be given what they had: a bowl of thin pottage, made from boiled vegetables and grains, a thick slab of dark, heavy bread, and a cup of water or weak, cloudy ale. It had little flavor, but it was warm, filling, and offered without charge. After days of chewing on stale crusts and disappointment, it tasted like the finest meal of your life. Sleeping arrangements were similarly austere. Larger monasteries had a dedicated guest hall, or hospitium, which was a generous term for a long, drafty room filled with wooden benches or straw pallets on the floor. You would share this space with a dozen other strangers, all of you wrapped in your own cloaks, the silence broken only by the occasional cough or a muttered prayer. There was no privacy, but there was a profound sense of shared, quiet relief. Life in the monastery was governed by the tolling of bells, and your stay was no exception. You would likely be woken long before dawn, perhaps at 3 or 4 in the morning, by the call to matins, the first prayer service of the day. From the guest hall, you would hear the faint, haunting sound of Gregorian chants echoing through the stone chapel, a reminder that this place ran on a schedule dictated by heaven, not by the sun. The monks asked for no money. The price of your stay was your conduct. You were expected to be quiet, respectful, and above all, grateful. You were not to steal the spoons, disturb the prayers, or bring the sins of the outside world within their sacred walls. It was a simple transaction. In exchange for their charity, you offered your humility. It wasn't a comfortable stay, but it was safe, dry, and it came with just enough food to fuel your journey for another day. So your feet are blistered, your shoes officially gave up 2 villages ago, and the barn owl you tried to share a tree with last night was deeply unimpressed with your company. Welcome, weary traveler, to the medieval equivalent of a bus stop shelter, the roadside shrine. These were not grand chapels, or even modest churches. Think of them more as holy vending machines, dispensing spiritual comfort instead of snacks. Dotted along major pilgrimage routes and at lonely crossroads, these shrines were small, simple structures of wood or stone. Inside, they might house a faded painting or a crudely carved statue of the Virgin Mary or a local saint, their faces worn smooth by centuries of weather and worried prayers. Their purpose was to offer a moment of piety for the passing traveler. But for the penniless peasant, they served a much more practical function. These shrines became sacred snooze booths. If you were lucky, the small, slanted roof projected out just enough to offer cover. It wasn't a room, It was a niche, a small pocket of space, barely large enough to huddle in, with your knees pulled up to your chest. You couldn't lie down, but you could sit, lean against the cold stone, and be shielded from the falling rain or the morning dew. It wasn't comfort, but it was cover. One of the greatest benefits of sleeping at a shrine was the element of plausible deniability. If a suspicious night watchman or a local lord happened upon you snoring at the feet of St. Giles, you could simply jolt awake and claim you were overcome with devotion during a late-night prayer session. It was a perfect excuse, blending piety and exhaustion in a way that was difficult to argue with. There was also a tangible sense of security. Medieval bandits might have been ruthless, but many were also deeply superstitious. Robbing a merchant on the open road was one thing. Committing a crime on sacred ground, directly beneath the painted, judgmental eyes of a martyred saint, was tempting fate in a way most were unwilling to risk. The shrine offered a thin but powerful cloak of divine protection. Of course, the experience was far from luxurious. The stone floor was unforgivingly hard, and the cramped space made it impossible to stretch your aching limbs. The wind still seemed to find every crack and opening, chilling you to the bone. Some well-maintained shrines were tended by nearby villagers, who might not appreciate finding a muddy vagrant using their holy site as a bedroom. Yet, despite the cold and the discomfort, there was a quiet, psychological solace to be found. Huddled in the dark, with the calm, impassive face of a wooden saint as your only company, it was easy to feel that you were not entirely alone. It was a feeling that some saintly guardian was watching over you, protecting you from the things that lurked in the dark. In a world full of tangible dangers, this small, imagined safety was a comfort beyond price. After the 7th blister, the 15th dismissive headshake, and the 3rd time you were chased out of a field by a goat with a sense of personal space, you start to fantasize. You dream of a real bed, a hot meal, or, at the very least, a roof that doesn't have holes in it. It's at this point of near total despair that the warm, flickering light from an alehouse window begins to look less like a building and more like a divine vision. Alehouses and taverns were the medieval equivalent of a roadside truck stop, a place for cheap drinks, questionable company, and a level of noise and grime that could peel paint. But for the freezing, exhausted traveler, they offered something priceless: warmth. The collective body heat of 3 dozen patrons, combined with a roaring hearth, created a pocket of comfort in the cold, dark night. For a moment, you could almost forget the misery of the road. But this warmth came at a price, and that price was coin. This was not a monastery built on charity. It was a business. If you had money, you were a welcome customer. If you didn't, the heavy oak door had a wonderful, final-sounding thud as it slammed in your face. Your empty coin pouch was a clear sign that you and your aura of hopeless poverty were not welcome here. The key to entry was to have at least a single, precious penny. With it, you could buy a wooden cup of weak, watery ale, a drink you would nurse for hours, making yourself as small and unobtrusive as possible. Your goal was to outlast the paying customers, to become part of the furniture until the innkeeper was too tired to care, hoping your 1-penny investment would buy you a night's shelter. Sometimes, if the innkeeper was in a charitable mood or enjoyed the gossip you brought from the road, your small purchase was enough. He might gesture towards a spot on the floor near the dying embers of the hearth. This wasn't an offer of a room, but a temporary reprieve from the cold. You had paid for your drink, and the sleep was a free, if grimy, bonus. Privacy was a concept from another universe. You would sleep on the floor, which was likely sticky with spilled ale and strewn with discarded rushes, shoulder to shoulder with other travelers who had struck a similar bargain. The air would be thick with the sound of snoring, sleep muttering, and the scurrying of rats who were permanent residents. The benches were hard, the floor was harder, but it was indoors. Yet, for all the noise and filth, there was a strange comfort to be found. The lingering warmth from the fireplace was a profound luxury, a shield against the damp chill of the night. It was a warmth that felt human, born of company and commerce. In the alehouse, surrounded by the snores of strangers, you were reminded that you were not entirely alone in the world, just another soul seeking a brief respite on a long and difficult journey. Picture this: it's getting dark, the wind has a cruel, biting edge, and your options have been narrowed down to sleeping in a puddle or knocking on the door of a stranger who probably hasn't had a bath since Easter. It is time to deploy the peasant traveler's final survival strategy, begging for shelter. This was not the modern Airbnb experience. There were no online reviews, no confirmation numbers, and certainly no fresh linens. It was more like a game of chance, where the grand prize was not getting yelled at. You would select a house that looked humble enough to be sympathetic, but not so poor that they had nothing to share. With a deep breath to steady your nerves, you would approach, knock softly, and when the door opened, you would put on your most tragic, least threatening expression. You would plead your case, speaking of your long journey, your sore feet, and your desperate need for a place by the fire, just for the night. If you were lucky, truly lucky, the family inside would take pity. Maybe the old farmer remembered his own youthful travels, or perhaps his wife saw the desperation in your eyes and thought of her own son. The door would swing open wider, and you would be ushered from the biting cold into the smoky, cramped warmth of a one-room peasant hut. The air inside would be thick with the smells of boiled cabbage, damp wool, and perhaps even a goat who might be sharing the quarters. You might even be offered a meal, a gesture of immense generosity. This would be a share of whatever the family was eating. A bowl of thin stew, a hunk of dark bread, and water that didn't glow in the dark. In return for this charity, you were expected to provide something of value. News from the next village, stories from the road, or simply a new face to break the monotony of their hard life. Your tales were the price of your supper. Your bed for the night would be the least desirable spot on the packed earth floor. If the family was generous, they might give you a pile of scratchy rags or a bit of straw to lie on. You would sleep in the same room as the entire family, their snores and coughs becoming a strange, intimate soundtrack to your rest. Privacy was not a concept, survival was. But at least it was indoors, and at least it was warm. Of course, this all relied on a fragile trust. You, the stranger, were expected to behave like a saint. You would not steal, you would not complain, and you would certainly not cause any trouble. You were an anonymous guest, and your primary duty was to be gone by sunrise, to vanish as quietly as you had appeared, leaving your hosts with nothing but the memory of their own good deed. This strategy was the ultimate gamble. The stranger who opened the door could just as easily have been cruel, suspicious, or dangerous. In a world where trust was as scarce as coin, opening your home to an unknown traveler was a risk for the host, and seeking shelter within it was a risk for the guest. But sometimes it worked. Sometimes a stranger's kindness was the only thing that stood between a traveler and a cold, lonely death on the road. There comes a point in every peasant's journey when desperation sparks a strange kind of innovation. The night is too cold, the barn is full of judgmental cows, and the local shrine has already been claimed by someone who snores like a dragon gargling gravel. When you find yourself in a town instead of the countryside, a new option reveals itself as the crowds thin and the merchants pack up. The marketplace. By day, a medieval market was a chaotic explosion of the senses, a roaring theater of shouting vendors, bleating animals, the sharp smell of spices, and the ever-present risk of a pickpocket. But by night, it transformed into a ghost town. The vibrant square became a desolate landscape of empty wooden stalls, overturned carts, and the day's debris. In other words, for a traveler with nowhere to go, it was prime real estate. The wooden stalls were your primary target. Most were simple frames, with a thatched or canvas roof, more for shade than for serious protection. But they offered a solid barrier against the wind and a decent shield from the rain. If you didn't mind the lingering smell of onions and old fish, and let's be honest, as a medieval peasant, your standards were low. They were perfectly adequate for a night's rest. You would find a dark corner, perhaps tucking yourself under a fishmonger's counter, or behind a stack of empty chicken crates. You would wrap your thin cloak around you, using your sack as a pillow, and try not to dream of the roasted meats that had been sold from that very spot only hours earlier. The ground would be hard and littered with the day's refuse, but it was a small price to pay for a roof over your head. There was a strategic advantage to this location. Markets were the heart of any town, centrally located near roads, churches, and taverns. Sleeping there gave you a head start in the morning. You could be up with the sun and gone before the merchants arrived to set up, vanishing back into the morning crowds. Or you could be the first in line to beg for scraps or seek a day's labor. Of course, this urban camping came with its own set of risks. Most towns had a night watch, a group of guards who patrolled the streets and did not appreciate finding unlicensed sleepers among the stalls. If you were caught, you could expect a rude awakening from the end of a wooden staff, followed by a harsh scolding and being chased out into the darkness. You had to be silent and invisible. And then there were the other residents. The market at night was the domain of stray dogs, opportunistic rats, and geese. Never underestimate medieval geese. They were loud, territorial, and seemed to hold a personal grudge against all of humanity. Sharing your sleeping space with them was an exercise in careful negotiation. Still, it beat sleeping in a muddy alley, and sometimes, if you were lucky, a careless vendor might have left behind a bruised apple or a stale crust of bread, a feast for a king in your circumstances. In the great medieval game of travel, there was one special move that could increase your chances of sleeping indoors, declaring your journey a pilgrimage. Whether you were genuinely off to see a saint's knucklebone in a distant cathedral, or just cleverly avoiding your landlord, if you were a pilgrim, you unlocked access to medieval travel's only loyalty program. This program came in the form of pilgrim hostels. These hostels, sometimes called hospitia, were religious guest houses established specifically for the holy wanderer, run by monks, nuns, or charitable guilds. They were built on the belief that aiding a pilgrim was a direct path to earning favor with God. They offered shelter, a simple meal, and the sweet, sweet promise of not having to sleep in a ditch, all in exchange for your piety. To gain entry, you usually needed proof. This was the pilgrim's badge, a small token, often made of cheap pewter or lead, that signified your destination or purpose. A scallop shell for the journey to Santiago de Compostela, a palm frond for one returning from Jerusalem, or a small insignia from a local shrine. This badge was your backstage pass, the thing that separated you from a common vagrant in the eyes of your hosts. Inside, the luxuries were modest but profound. The accommodations were a definite upgrade from a standard monastery guest hall. You might find a long dormitory room filled with actual straw mattresses, not just loose piles of hay. There might even be rough wool blankets to ward off the night's chill. Some hostels even had facilities for pilgrims to wash their sore, dusty feet, an act of hospitality that felt like the height of luxury. The food, while still simple, was reliable. A warm bowl of pottage and a hunk of bread were standard fare, but it was given with a sense of shared purpose. You would eat in a communal hall, surrounded by fellow travelers from all walks of life, sharing stories of the road, exchanging tips about dangerous river crossings, and bonding over your shared arduous journey. It was a place of community, not just charity. Of course, there were rules. You were a guest, and your behavior was expected to reflect the holy nature of your quest. You were to be sober, quiet, and prayerful. Any fighting, stealing, or general troublemaking would see you cast out immediately. The charity of the hostel was a gift, and it could be revoked if you were deemed unworthy of it. For the poor peasant on a legitimate pilgrimage, these hostels were nothing short of a miracle. They were sanctuaries of care and order, spaced out along the winding, chaotic roads of medieval Europe. They were a sign that your difficult journey was not just a personal struggle, but a recognized act of faith, supported by a network of strangers. For a few nights, at least, you could rest easy, knowing that your piety had earned you a safe place to sleep. Ah, the medieval noble estate, a sprawling domain of manicured gardens, soaring turrets, and a backyard full of outbuildings, absolutely perfect for a peasant seeking a discreet place to sleep. For the particularly bold or desperate traveler, the lands of a lord offered a wealth of opportunity, so long as you understood your place. And that place was almost always behind the stables, preferably near the manure heap. Let's be perfectly clear. You were not strolling up to the castle gate and asking the lord for a spare room. That kind of behavior was a fast track to being acquainted with the castle guards and their distinct lack of hospitality. No, the goal here was not to be a guest, but to be an invisible squatter. You were interested in the vast ecosystem of barns, granaries, tool sheds, and stables that supported the main house. These outbuildings were a traveler's dream. Stables were often warm, filled with the body heat of expensive horses and the rich, comforting smell of hay. Granaries were dry and offered sacks of grain that could be shaped into a surprisingly comfortable, if lumpy, mattress. Even a simple woodshed provided for walls and a roof, which by this point in your journey felt like the height of architectural genius. On the rarest of occasions, you might be granted official permission. If you were lucky enough to encounter a charitable steward, or if the Lord was in a particularly pious mood, you might be allowed to sleep in a barn. Allowing a peasant not to freeze to death was, after all, a relatively inexpensive way to earn points with heaven. But most peasants didn't dare to ask. The more common method was one of stealth and silence. You would wait for the sun to set, find a poorly maintained section of fence or a low stone wall, and slip onto the property like a shadow. You moved quietly, keeping to the dark patches, your eyes scanning for guards on patrol. Your destination was the darkest, most overlooked corner you could find, a forgotten hayloft, or the space behind a row of barrels. Here, you would curl up and try to blend in with the inanimate objects. The risks, of course, were enormous. If a guard on his nightly rounds discovered you, the outcome depended entirely on his mood. You might be gruffly chased off the property, or you might receive a beating for your audacity. Worse still, in a paranoid household, you could be accused of being a thief or a poacher, crimes that carried severe and painful punishments. There was also the livestock to consider. A nobleman's prized warhorse was not the same as a farmer's docile cow, and might not appreciate being used as a personal space heater. And nearly every estate had dogs. Loud, aggressive dogs trained to view strangers as threats. To be successful, you had to be invisible, silent, and gone before the first hint of dawn, ensuring that nothing disturbed the Lord's world, least of all the sight of an uninvited peasant snoring behind the compost pile. In the great medieval game of where dash can dash I dash sleep dash without dash paying dash or dash being dash eaten, stumbling upon an abandoned building was like hitting the jackpot. Sure, it was probably collapsing, definitely full of rats, and almost certainly cursed, but it had one unbeatable feature. It was free, and no one was there to tell you to leave. The beauty of a ruined cottage, a burnt-out smithy, or a forgotten mill was the complete lack of an owner. Nobles didn't send guards after you. Monks didn't expect you to wake up for prayers. And tavern keepers didn't charge you a week's wages for a bowl of watery gruel. If you could get past the gaping holes in the roof and the unsettling whispers the wind made as it blew through the rafters, you were golden. These structures were often sad relics of less fortunate times. A small village wiped out by the plague, its homes left to rot, a watchtower abandoned after the border shifted, a farmhouse where the family simply packed up and left, defeated by famine or taxes. To the average person, they were grim reminders of misfortune. To you, the weary traveler, they were vacant rooms with immediate availability. You didn't ask questions. You saw a roof partial, a door optional, and a floor ret-infested, but still a floor. You would sweep a small corner clear of debris, perhaps stuff some dry leaves or straw into a pile for a makeshift bed, and settle in. The walls, though crumbling, still broke the wind, and the partial roof might just keep you dry if it rained. It was a ruin, but it was your ruin for the night. Of course, there was a reason these places were empty, and in the medieval mind, that reason was almost always supernatural. Everyone knew that abandoned buildings were haunted. That strange creaking noise, a ghost, the sudden cold draft, a restless spirit, that creepy goat staring at you through a hole in the wall at 3 a.m. Probably a demon, but also, possibly just a goat, probably. This made for a restless night. Your profound exhaustion was at war with your deep-seated superstition. You would lie there in the oppressive darkness, listening to the groans of the dying building, and tell yourself it was just the wind. But every skittering sound from the corner of the room would have you wondering if the building's former deceased owner was about to ask you for rent. Still, haunted buildings were often a safer bet than sleeping in the open. They offered real shelter from the elements and, more importantly, from other humans. And just occasionally, they came with forgotten treasures. A bit of dry firewood left by a previous squatter, a rusty but usable pot, or a few edible herbs growing in a sheltered garden. In a world of constant scarcity, these small discoveries felt like blessings from the very ghosts you were trying to ignore. In the grand, stitched-together story of medieval life, with its threads of famine, plague, and people tossing chamber pots out of windows, there existed, believe it or not, the occasional kind stranger. This was not a common occurrence, mind you, but every once in a while, a traveling peasant would hit the social lottery and meet someone who didn't immediately treat them like a piece of mud that had learned to walk. These rare individuals came in many forms. An old widow living at the edge of a village who remembered what it was like to be hungry and alone. A tired farmer who had an extra crust of bread and a half-empty spot in his barn. Or a pious merchant who genuinely believed that offering a stranger a moment of respite was his sacred duty. Whatever their reason, they saw your weary, tragic state and chose compassion over suspicion. The offer, when it came, was usually simple and unadorned. There was no grand speech, just a quiet, practical gesture. You look cold, come sit by the fire. Or, there's room in the hayloft if you need it. The goat doesn't bite, usually. For a traveler accustomed to being ignored or chased away, these simple words felt like a miracle. Often, this kindness was not entirely without strings. It was part of an unspoken social contract. In return for a bowl of stew and a place to sleep, you might be expected to help. Chop some wood for the morning fire, fetch a few buckets of water from the well, or tell a story to the children. It was a fair trade. Your labor and news from the road in exchange for their warmth and food. Of course, accepting the kindness of a stranger was always a risk. Not every person who smiled was a friend. There were stories of travelers who were lured into homes only to be robbed or worse. The desperate peasant had to become an expert in reading faces, in judging intent from a few muttered words, weighing the promise of a warm, dry night against the potential for disaster. Word of mouth helped travelers navigate this landscape of risk and reward. On the road, vagrants and pilgrims would exchange whispered information about who could be trusted. Old Man Hemlock near the crooked bridge has a kind heart, one might say. Or, the baker's wife in the next town will sometimes give you day-old bread if you ask. This created a fragile, invisible map of safe havens. These encounters were the exception that proved the rule of a harsh and unforgiving world. But their rarity made them all the more powerful. A single night of warmth, a shared meal, and a moment of human connection could be enough to restore a traveler's will to continue. In a world where trust was as rare as a warm bath in January, a kind stranger was a reminder that goodness, however scarce, had not vanished entirely. Let's clear one thing up right away. When we talk about poor peasants sleeping with animals, we are talking about proximity, not passion. This is not a medieval romance. It's a story about survival. It's about the desperate, shivering calculus of a traveler in the dark, realizing that the only thing standing between them and hypothermia is a large, hairy beast named Marjorie. When the winter wind is howling, you cuddle up to the nearest cow and try not to think about the smell. Animals were medieval central heating. Cows, sheep, oxen, goats, and even pigs radiated a constant, low-grade warmth, like furry breathing radiators that occasionally tried to eat your bedding. In a world without insulation or central heating, this animal warmth was a life-saving resource. The difference between sleeping alone in a cold barn and sleeping near a 110 ox was the difference between misery and mere discomfort. This was not a strange concept for a peasant. In many of the poorest homes, the livestock were brought inside at night, especially during the cold months. It kept the animals safe from thieves and predators, and their collective body heat helped warm the single room where the entire family lived and slept. The pig had its corner, the family had theirs, and the chickens wandered wherever they pleased. The line between the human and animal worlds was blurry at best. On the road, this principle was applied with strategic precision. If you were granted shelter in a barn, you didn't just pick a random spot. You conducted a quiet assessment, looking for the most docile, largest, and warmest-looking resident. You would then settle into the hay, a respectful distance away, close enough to bask in their radiated heat, but not so close as to risk getting kicked into the next week if they had a bad dream. Of course, there were drawbacks. The fleas and lice that lived on the animals were thrilled to have a new host. The smells could be overwhelming, a potent cocktail of manure, sweat, and whatever the animal had for dinner, and the noises, the endless, rhythmic chewing, the sudden snorts, the heavy shifting of weight, made for a far from peaceful night's sleep. Yet a strange sort of bond could form in the darkness. That sheep who didn't immediately run away when you huddled near its flock became your closest confidant. The donkey that let you lean against its flank without trying to bite you was practically family. These were not friendships of affection, but of desperate, grateful utility. They were your unwitting saviors. In many ways, these animal hosts were more dependable than humans. They didn't ask you invasive questions. They didn't judge the patches on your tunic, and they never asked for a single coin you didn't have. They simply existed, snorted, and kept you from freezing. In the grand and often cruel economy of the medieval road that made them the best roommates a poor traveler could ever hope for. So, you've done it. You trudged through endless mud, slept beside goats, begged for bread crusts from strangers, and managed to avoid being robbed more than once. Congratulations, now you get to do the entire thing all over again, but in reverse. The return journey for a poor peasant was not some glorious homecoming. It was more like retracing your own bad decisions, only this time with more lice and slightly less hope. And yet, you are not the same person who left the village weeks ago. You are wiser now, not with the knowledge of books, but with the practical, hard-won wisdom of the road. This is peasant wisdom. You now know which types of barns have the softest hay, which roadside shrines don't smell of goat urine, and which innkeepers are most likely to let you sleep by the fire for the price of a single ale. You have a mental map, not of places, but of potential kindnesses and likely dangers. Your expectations have also been ground down to their absolute minimum. Before, you might have been optimistic enough to dream of a bed. Now, you see a dry ditch and think to yourself, luxury. That soggy turnip you traded for your last wooden button. An excellent bargain. That priest who gave you a stern 45-minute lecture on the nature of sin before handing you a bowl of soup. At least the soup was warm. The journey has taken its physical toll. You are more bone than flesh. Your tunic is more patched than fabric, and your feet are a testament to your suffering, a landscape of blisters, calluses, and old wounds. You are a walking collection of grime, exhaustion, and regret. But beneath the dirt and weariness, there is a new, steely resilience. You have faced the worst the road can offer, and you are still walking. You survived the medieval hospitality lottery. You faced hunger, cold, loneliness, and the profound awkwardness of trying to sleep next to a snoring pig. You have lived to tell the tale, although you know that no one back home will truly understand it. You can describe the feeling of waking up in a graveyard, but they will only hear a strange story, not the bone-deep cold or the quiet terror of it. The journey has changed you in ways you can't quite explain. Your worldview, once confined to the borders of your village, is now broader. You know the kindness of strangers, the utility of a warm animal, and the deep spiritual relief of finding an abandoned hovel during a rainstorm. The world is a much larger, harsher, and stranger place than you ever imagined. You left home as a peasant. You return as well, still a peasant. But you are a peasant with stories, a peasant who has seen the next valley and lived. And as you finally crest that last hill and see the familiar curl of smoke rising from your village, the feeling is not one of triumphant joy, but of profound, bone-weary relief. You are home, for now. Our weary traveler has returned. The road is behind them, and they are finally home. But what was the home that a medieval peasant returned to? Was it a cozy cottage, a warm and welcoming sanctuary from the harshness of the world? Not exactly. Having explored the temporary miseries of the road, let us now turn to the permanent discomforts of the peasant household. Home was not an escape from hardship. It was simply the place where the hardship lived. From the outside, your house is not a charming, storybook cottage. It is a low, squat, and slightly lopsided structure that seems to be hunching against the wind. It is likely a cruck house, built around a simple frame of two large curved timbers, like giant wooden ribs, that meet at the peak of the roof. This frame is the skeleton, and the walls are the skin, made of a technique called wattle and daub. This meant the walls were a lattice of woven sticks. The wattle, caked with a thick plaster. The daub, made from whatever was available: clay, mud, straw, animal dung, and maybe some horsehair to bind it all together. This mixture was surprisingly effective at keeping the wind out, but it was in a constant state of crumbling and required regular, messy repairs. The whole structure looked less like it was built and more like it had grown out of the damp earth. The roof, your primary defense against the English rain, is a thick, heavy blanket of thatch made from bundles of reeds or straw. When new, it would be golden brown and reasonably waterproof, but over time it would darken, rot, and become a thriving ecosystem for mice, birds, insects, and anything else that enjoyed living in damp, decaying vegetable matter. It was a living roof, in the least appealing sense of the word. There is a single, low doorway, perhaps covered with a thick woolen cloth or a rough wooden door hanging on leather hinges. Windows are a luxury you cannot afford. If you have any at all, they are just small, unglazed slits in the daub, high up on the wall. They are not for looking out of. They are for letting a tiny bit of smoke escape while letting in the absolute minimum of rain and cold. The house has no foundations. Its timber frame rests directly on the ground, or perhaps on a few large stones. The floor inside is the same packed earth as the ground outside, meaning it is perpetually cold and prone to dampness, especially during the wet seasons. Water from the ground seeps up, turning the floor into a cool, clammy mud in winter and a dusty, flea-infested surface in summer. Surrounding your hovel is a small patch of land, your croft. This is not a lawn for leisure, but a garden for survival. Here you grow cabbages, onions, and peas. There might be a small, muddy enclosure for a pig, a few chickens scratching in the dirt, and a precious, carefully stacked pile of firewood. This small patch of mud and vegetables is as vital to your existence as the roof over your head. You push aside the heavy cloth flap that serves as a door and duck your head to step inside your home. The first thing that hits you is the darkness, followed immediately by the smoke. The air inside is thick, acrid, and warm, a permanent fog that stings your eyes and catches in the back of your throat. It takes a moment for your vision to adjust to the gloom. A world lit only by the faint light from the doorway and the dull orange glow of the central fire. The second thing you notice is that you can see the entire house without turning your head, because it is all one room. This single, cramped space is where your family eats, sleeps, cooks, socializes, is born, gets sick, and eventually dies. The concept of privacy is a fantasy as distant and unattainable as a king's crown. Every moment of your life is shared, overheard, and witnessed by the other members of your family. The heart of this single room is the hearth. This is not a grand stone fireplace with a cozy mantelpiece. It is a shallow pit dug into the center of the packed earth floor, perhaps lined with a few stones to keep the embers contained. This open fire is your only source of heat for the cold winters, your only light after the sun goes down, and the only place to cook your meager meals. It is the center of your world. Because there is no chimney, the smoke from the constantly smoldering fire has nowhere to go but up. It rises in a thick, gray cloud, coating the thatched roof and the wooden beams with a black, greasy layer of soot. A small hole might be left in the thatch to let some of the smoke escape, but this also serves as a perfect entry point for rain. You are faced with a constant choice: suffocate in the smoke or be dripped on. The furniture is sparse and brutally functional. There is no concept of a matching set. A rough, hand-hewn bench might run along one wall. A large log might serve as a stool. In one corner, a simple wooden chest holds the family's most prized possessions: a single iron cooking pot, a few wooden bowls, and a spare woolen blanket. Everything is made from wood, and everything is stained dark by the ever-present smoke. The beds are not beds at all, but piles of straw, bracken, or heather laid out on the dirt floor. The entire family often shares one large pile to combine their body heat against the cold. This bedding is rarely changed, and it quickly becomes a thriving metropolis for fleas, lice, and other biting insects. Sleep is less a peaceful rest and more a nightly truce in your ongoing war with parasites. And you are not the only occupants. On the coldest nights, or to protect them from thieves, the family's most valuable animals are brought inside. The family pig, the milk cow, if you are lucky enough to own one, and a handful of chickens will share the single room with you. They add their warmth, their smells, and their noises to the already crowded space, making your home feel less like a house and more like a very small, very smoky barn. To truly understand the medieval peasant home, you have to move beyond what it looked like and immerse yourself in what it felt like. Life in the hovel was a constant, unfiltered assault on the senses. In our modern world, we are experts at controlling our environment. We shut out the noise, filter the air, and banish the dark with the flick of a switch. For the medieval peasant, there were no such barriers. The world, in all its raw intensity, was always right there with you. Let's begin with the smell, because it was the most dominant and unavoidable sensation. The primary note in this symphony of scents was smoke, a sharp, acrid, woody smoke from the open hearth that never went out. It clung to your hair, your clothes, and the back of your throat. It seasoned your food and was the first thing you smelled in the morning and the last thing you smelled at night. Layered beneath that was the damp, earthy smell of the dirt floor, the sour, pungent aroma of unwashed human bodies, and the unmistakable ammonia temps of animal waste from your livestock roommates. The sounds of the hovel were a constant, quiet chorus. It was never truly silent. There was the endless, soft crackle and hiss of the fire, the rhythmic, meditative chewing of a cow in the corner, and the soft grunts of a sleeping pig. After a storm, you would hear the slow, steady drip-drip of water leaking through the thatch. At night, the snores, coughs, and sleep mutterings of your family filled the small space, a constant reminder that you were never alone. The sense of touch was a catalogue of discomforts. The air was always damp and chilly, even near the fire. The rough-spun wool of your tunic and blanket was perpetually scratchy against your skin. Any wooden surface, a bench, a bowl, was coarse and splintery to the touch, and the floor beneath your bare feet was a changing landscape of cool, clammy mud, packed down dirt, and the occasional sharp stone. Light itself was a texture. During the day, the interior of the hovel remained in a perpetual twilight, the gloom cut only by a single dusty shaft of light from a window slit filled with dancing motes. At night, the darkness was almost absolute, a thick, heavy blanket that felt close and suffocating. The only reprieve was the gentle, flickering glow of the hearth, which painted the small room in deep, dancing shadows that turned familiar shapes into monsters. Even your food was shaped by this environment. Everything tasted faintly of smoke. The watery pottage of boiled vegetables, the coarse, dark bread, even the water drawn from the well. All of it carried the flavor of the fire. The taste of your life was the taste of smoke, earth, and the slight bitterness of poverty. There was no variety, only the endless, dull repetition of subsistence. There was no escape from this sensory world, no door to shut, no window to open. You lived, breathed, and slept in a thick soup of smoke, animal smells, and dampness. It was a life of total immersion, where the boundary between you and your environment was almost non-existent. To be home was to feel the raw, unfiltered reality of your existence in every breath you took and every surface you touched. Life within the peasant hovel was governed by a simple, unyielding rhythm, the rising and setting of the sun. There were no clocks on the wall, only the slow crawl of light across the dirt floor. Your day began not with a gentle awakening, but with the first gray, murky light that filtered through the smoke hole in the roof. You would wake up stiff and cold, the smoky air heavy in your lungs, to the sounds of your family and your livestock stirring in the shared darkness. The first and most important task of the day belonged to the woman of the house, tending the hearth. The fire was the lifeblood of the home and was rarely allowed to go out completely. She would carefully uncover the embers from the previous night's ashes, coaxing them back to life with her breath and a few precious pieces of kindling. This fire meant warmth against the morning chill and the promise of a cooked meal later in the day. Its revival was the true start of the day. There was no breakfast as we would know it. The morning meal was a hasty, functional affair, designed to provide just enough energy to start the day's labor. It might be a hunk of leftover dark bread, hard as a rock, or a small bowl of watery porridge that had been kept warm by the edge of the fire. There was no time to sit and linger. The fields and the chores were already waiting. For the woman, her world of work was the hovel and the small plot of land around it. After the men and older children left for the fields, her day would be a relentless cycle of demanding tasks. She would haul heavy wooden buckets of water from the village well or a nearby stream. She would tend the small vegetable garden, weeding and watering the cabbages and onions that were crucial to the family's survival. She would milk the cow or goat, feed the chickens, and slop the pig. A huge portion of her day was dedicated to preparing the evening meal, which was often the only hot, substantial food the family would eat. This was not a simple task. It involved grinding grain for bread or porridge, using a heavy, hand-turned cornstone, a physically exhausting process. She would then spend hours simmering pottage, a thick vegetable stew, over the smoky hearth, a meal that was in a constant state of preparation. In the moments between these larger chores, her hands were never still. She would almost always be spinning, using a simple drop spindle to turn raw wool or flax into thread for the family's clothes. Every scrap of fabric was precious, so she would spend hours mending torn tunics and patching worn-out leggings. There was no concept of leisure. Every waking moment was filled with an activity essential for keeping the family alive, fed, and clothed. As the sun began to set, the family would return from the fields, their bodies aching with the day's labor. They would gather around the fire, dipping their spoons or pieces of bread into the communal cooking pot to eat the evening meal. This was the one time the family was all together, sharing the warmth of the fire. And then, with the darkness complete, there was little else to do. They would soon retreat to their straw bedding, ready to repeat the exact same cycle at the first hint of dawn. Step inside the smoky, one-room hovel and take an inventory of your possessions. In a world of profound scarcity, you do not own things for decoration, for status, or for pleasure. Every single object in your home is a tool for survival, acquired through immense effort or passed down as a precious heirloom. There is no clutter. Your material world is stripped down to the bare essentials. Your most valuable possession, the item that might even be listed in a lord's records upon your death, is the iron cooking pot. Suspended over the central hearth, this blackened, dented vessel is the key to your family's survival. Metal was expensive, and a large pot that could simmer the daily pottage for your entire family was an enormous investment. It was likely inherited from your parents, and you would pass it on to your children. To lose it or break it would be a catastrophe. The rest of your kitchenware is simple and functional. There are no individual plates. The family eats directly from the communal pot with spoons carved from wood or animal horns. You might have a few wooden bowls, a wooden cup, and a single sharp iron knife used for everything from slicing bread to mending leather. These items are kept on a low shelf or simply placed on the dirt floor when not in use. Your only piece of real furniture is a large wooden chest pushed against one wall. This is your wardrobe, your pantry, and your safe, all in one. It is the only place to keep your few valuables safe from the damp, the mice, and the chickens. Inside, you might find a spare woolen tunic, a whetstone to keep your knife sharp, a small bag of seeds saved for the next planting, and perhaps a sentimental item like a smooth stone from a river or a pilgrim's badge from a long-ago journey. Your wardrobe is as minimal as your home. You likely own one set of clothes, the one you are currently wearing, and maybe one spare for emergencies. These garments are made, of course, scratchy wool or linen, spun and woven by the women in your family or village. They are endlessly patched and mended, worn until the fabric is thin as a spiderweb and finally falls apart, at which point the scraps are repurposed as cleaning rags. The tools of your household are extensions of your own hands. A pair of heavy wooden buckets for carrying water, a stone quern for grinding grain, a simple drop spindle for making thread, and perhaps a small hand sickle for tending your garden. These are not personal items, but communal family property, the engines of your small domestic economy. Beyond these tangible things, your possessions are few. You own the stories your grandmother told you, the songs you sing to your children, and the prayers you mutter in the dark. You have knowledge of which herbs can soothe a fever and which mushrooms are safe to eat. In a life with almost no material wealth, these intangible bits of knowledge and culture are among the most precious things you have. They weigh nothing, but they are essential for survival. Having returned to the peasant hovel, let us now turn to the question that governed daily life more than any other. What is there to eat? For a medieval peasant, food was not a source of pleasure or creativity. It was fuel. Your diet was defined by two simple, unyielding realities: what you could grow in your small garden and the surrounding fields, and what the lord of the manor allowed you to keep after he had taken his share. The absolute cornerstone of your diet was bread, but you must banish any image of a light, fluffy white loaf. The bread of a peasant was a heavy, dark, and dense affair called maslin. It was made from a mixture of grains, typically wheat for substance and rye for resilience, but often bulked out with cheaper grains like barley, oats, and even dried pea flour in lean times. This bread was coarse, chewy, and substantial. A single thick slice was a meal in itself. Baking this bread was a communal and often costly affair. Few peasants had their own ovens. Instead, you were required to use the lord's communal oven in the village, and for this privilege you had to pay a fee. This payment was usually made in kind, meaning you had to hand over a portion of your precious flour or one of your finished loaves to the lord's baker. The simple act of baking was another form of taxation. The second pillar of your diet, simmering away eternally in the iron pot over your hearth, was pottage. This was less a specific dish and more a perpetual stew, the medieval equivalent of a slow cooker that was never turned off. It was a thick, savory porridge of grains and vegetables that formed the main evening meal, day after day, week after week. The ingredients of the pottage were dictated by the seasons and your garden. The base was almost always a cheap and filling grain like barley or oats. To this, you would add whatever vegetables were available from your croft: the humble but reliable cabbage, onions, leeks, turnips, and in the summer, peas and beans. Wild herbs and greens, gathered from the forest edges, might be thrown in for a bit of flavor. The pottage pot was rarely, if ever, emptied and scrubbed clean. Instead, it was a work in progress. New ingredients were simply added to what was left over from the day before. Yesterday's pottage formed the base for today's, creating a constantly evolving meal that simmered for hours over the low heat of the fire. It was an efficient, simple way to feed a family. Grains, the foundation of your entire existence, were consumed in other forms as well. Boiled with water or milk if you had it, they became a simple porridge or frumenty, an easy morning meal. and, crucially, they were fermented to make ale. This ale was not the strong, clear beer we know today. It was thick, cloudy, and nutritious, often called liquid bread. For many peasants, ale was a primary source of calories and was often safer to drink than the local water. So the peasant's menu was a trinity of grain: bread for substance, pottage for a hot meal, and ale for calories and hydration. It was a bland, monotonous, and repetitive diet, designed not to delight the senses but to provide the raw energy needed to wake up the next day and labor in the fields all over again. The daily diet of a peasant was a monotonous rotation of bread and pottage. But life was not entirely without its small luxuries and variations. Let's explore the rare treats and foraged foods that added a flicker of excitement to the peasant's plate. First, the most sought-after and least-attended food group: meat. For a peasant, meat was not a daily staple. It was a rare luxury, something you might taste only a few times a year, on major religious feast days like Christmas or Easter. The most common source of meat came from your own livestock, but only when the animal was at the end of its useful life. An old cow that no longer gave milk, or an ox too old to work in the fields, might be slaughtered. The most significant event was the autumn pig slaughter. A pig was a peasant's walking larder, fattened throughout the year on scraps. After the slaughter, the family would work frantically to preserve the meat, salting it to create bacon and ham that would provide precious flavor and fat during the lean winter months. The greatest source of temptation was the forest. The lord's lands were teeming with wild game: deer, boar, and rabbits. But these animals were his exclusive property. Hunting them was a serious crime known as poaching. The penalties for being caught were brutal, ranging from crippling fines to having a hand cut off, or even death. For a peasant, setting a small snare to catch a rabbit was a high-stakes gamble. A delicious, protein-rich meal weighed against the risk of ruin. Dairy and eggs were a more common and legal source of animal protein. If your family was prosperous enough to own a cow or a few goats, you had access to milk. While it spoiled quickly, it could be churned into butter or made into simple, soft cheeses that provided vital fat and calories. The few chickens scratching in your yard were more valuable for the eggs they laid than for their meat. An egg was a perfect, self-contained meal, a small treasure. The woods and hedgerows offered a free, seasonal bounty. In the late summer and autumn, the entire family would engage in foraging, gathering whatever nature provided. You would collect wild nuts like hazelnuts and walnuts, pick wild berries like blackberries and raspberries, and gather sour wild apples and pears. These foraged foods provided a welcome burst of sweetness and essential vitamins, a brief respite from the savory blandness of the daily pottage. The only sweetener available to a peasant was honey. Sugar was an astronomically expensive luxury imported from the East, completely out of reach. Honey, harvested from a wild beehive found in the woods, or from a hive kept by a wealthier neighbor, was therefore a precious, almost magical substance. It was used in tiny amounts, perhaps to sweeten a special holiday dish or to soothe a sore throat. This cycle of food had its dark side. The most difficult time of year was late winter and early spring. This was the hungry gap, when the food preserved from the autumn harvest was running low and the first crops of the new year had not yet grown. During these desperate weeks, hunger was a constant companion. A peasant's relationship with food was a direct reflection of the seasons. a brief period of autumn abundance, followed by a long, slow struggle for survival until the spring. Let us now turn to one of the most persistent images of the Middle Ages, the idea that people were unimaginably filthy and never washed. While a medieval peasant certainly wouldn't meet our modern standards of hygiene, the reality is more complex. People valued cleanliness as much as their circumstances allowed. The goal was not to be sterile, an impossible concept, but to be clean enough to be comfortable and socially presentable. Hygiene was a matter of effort, not ignorance. Your daily washing routine was simple and practical. It did not involve a hot shower. Upon waking, you would perform a basic wash using a wooden basin filled with cold water. This water, of course, had to be hauled by hand from the nearest well or stream, so it was used sparingly. You would wash your hands and face, and perhaps give your feet a quick rinse before starting the day. This was the fundamental, daily act of personal cleanliness. The sheer labor involved in managing water is key to understanding medieval hygiene. Every drop you used for washing, cooking, or drinking had to be carried in heavy wooden buckets over a considerable distance. This reality made the idea of a daily full-body bath an absurd fantasy. Water was a precious resource, earned through hard physical work, and it was not to be wasted on excessive bathing. When it came to cleaning, soap, as we know it, a pleasant, fragrant bar was a luxury reserved for the very wealthy. A peasant would have used more basic and abrasive methods. A rough linen cloth was the primary tool for scrubbing away dirt. For tougher grime, you might use sand or ashes from the fire. Simple, harsh soaps could be made from lye and animal fat, but these were caustic and unpleasant on the skin. The full-body bath was a rare and significant event, perhaps undertaken only a few times a year. It required an enormous amount of work. A large wooden tub would be brought into the hovel, placed near the fire, and slowly filled with pot after pot of heated water. This process took hours and consumed a huge amount of firewood. Often, the entire family would use the same bathwater, starting with the father, followed by the sons, then the mother, and finally the daughters. Hair was another challenge. It was typically worn long by both men and women, and was washed infrequently. When it was cleaned, it might be with water infused with herbs like rosemary or mint, which were thought to help repel the ever-present threat of lice and fleas. Combs, carefully carved from wood or bone, were an essential possession, used daily to detangle hair and, more importantly, to remove the parasites that were a simple fact of life. So yes, the average medieval peasant did not smell of roses. They smelled of hard work, of sweat, of the wood smoke that clung to their clothes, and of the animals they lived with. But this was the normal scent of humanity in the Middle Ages. Since everyone smelled more or less the same, it was not the offensive social taboo it is today. In a world of strong, earthy smells, the scent of a human body was just one more note in the chorus. Beyond the occasional full-body bath, a peasant's hygiene involved a constant low-level battle against the grime of daily life. Let's look at a few other aspects of cleanliness, from the mouth to the clothes on your back. What about dental care? While there were no dentists or toothbrushes, people did make an effort to clean their teeth and combat bad breath. The most common tool for dental hygiene was a simple twig. A small branch from a hazel or oak tree would be snapped off, and one end would be chewed until it frayed into a soft, bristly brush. This chew stick was then used to scrub the teeth, removing trapped food particles. People also used a piece of rough linen cloth, sometimes dipped in a mixture of salt and crushed herbs like mint, to rub their teeth clean. Surprisingly, the peasant diet had one major benefit for dental health. It contained almost no sugar. The absence of this primary cause of modern cavities, combined with a tough, abrasive diet that required a lot of chewing, meant that many peasants had teeth that were strong and free from decay, even if they were worn down from years of grinding coarse bread. The toilet situation was as basic as you would imagine. There was no indoor plumbing. Behind the hovel, there would be a small pit dug in the ground, sometimes enclosed within a tiny wooden shed for a bit of privacy. This was the privy. For use during the night or bad weather, the family had a chamber pot, a simple ceramic or wooden vessel. In the morning, its contents were unceremoniously tossed out the door into the yard or onto the manure heap. Washing clothes was a major physically demanding chore that was undertaken not daily or weekly, but perhaps only once a month or even less frequently. On laundry day, the women of the household would haul the family's entire collection of dirty garments to the nearest stream or river. This was an all-day affair, a significant event in the household calendar. The cleaning process was one of brute force. The clothes were first soaked in water, often mixed with a powerful cleaning agent called lye, which was made by leaching water through wood ash. This was a caustic, skin-irritating substance. After soaking, the clothes were beaten with a wooden paddle or slapped against large, smooth rocks to physically force the dirt out of the coarse fibers. After a final rinse in the cold river water, the clothes were laid out on bushes or spread on a grassy bank to dry in the sun and wind. The final product was not a soft, fragrant garment. The fabric would be stiff from the harsh lye and would still smell faintly of wood smoke. Clean, in the medieval sense, simply meant that the worst of the mud and sweat had been violently removed. It was another exhausting, cyclical battle in the long war for a semblance of cleanliness. And so our long journey comes to a close. We began with a lone traveler, a poor peasant, stepping onto a muddy road with nothing but a crust of bread and a prayer. We followed them through the cold and the dark, seeking shelter in the most humble of places, in the warm, animal-breathed air of a barn, in the unsettling quiet of a churchyard, and under the leaky roof of an abandoned hovel. We saw a world where a dry spot of ground was a luxury, and the kindness of a stranger was a miracle. We then returned with our traveler to the place they called home. We stepped across the threshold of the one-room hut and into a world of smoke, shadows, and ceaseless labor. We explored a life lived in a single, crowded space, shared with family and livestock alike. We inventoried the few precious possessions that made survival possible, and we sat at a table that was never truly full, sustained by a diet of monotonous, life-giving grains. From the relentless work of laundry day to the simple act of cleaning one's teeth with a twig, we have seen that the peasant's life, whether at home or on the road, was a constant struggle. It was a life defined by a profound lack of the things we take for granted: comfort, privacy, warmth, cleanliness, and security. It was a world stripped down to its barest essentials, where every day was a negotiation with hunger, cold, and exhaustion. Yet, it was also a world of incredible resilience. It was a life of quiet innovation, where a roadside shrine could become a bedroom and a warm cow could become a furnace. It was a life lived in deep, intimate connection with the seasons, the earth, and the small community that surrounded you. It was a world where a full belly, a dry roof, and a healthy family were not simple expectations, but profound blessings that one gave thanks for. This is the history that is so often forgotten. It is the story not of kings and queens, but of the millions of anonymous people whose silent, unending labor formed the true foundation of the medieval world. It is the boring history, the quiet history, the history of sleeping on straw and hoping for the sun to rise. And in its quietness, we can perhaps find a new perspective on our own world. As you lie in your comfortable bed in a warm, quiet room, perhaps take a moment to appreciate these simple, miraculous luxuries. The roof that doesn't leak, the water that flows freely, the light that comes with the flick of a switch. We live in the palaces that our peasant ancestors could never have imagined. Their hardship is a distant echo, but in listening to it, we can find a deeper sense of gratitude for the peace and comfort we now enjoy. Thank you for joining us on this long journey into the past. I hope it has been a restful and interesting exploration. If you've enjoyed this quiet look into the lives of ordinary people, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes for more boring history designed for sleep. Until next time, sleep well.